the Canadian Association of Gerontology, and I thought what she was doing was so fabulous. I snatched her and asked her to come from McMaster. So Jessica is doing a postdoctoral fellowship associated with the Department of Health, Aging and Society and the Gilbrea Center for Studies in Aging at McMaster. She's an anthropologist who engages, as we'll see today, in community-based participatory research focused on understanding and experiences of aging and dementia among Indigenous peoples. And she's worked with Anishinaabe communities in Manitoulin Island and is currently researching healthy aging, dementia, and intergenerational relations with Inuit communities in southern Labrador. Thanks so much.
All right, hello everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. This project is really close to my heart, and working with this community has been really amazing. I'll get a little bit into it later, but I've had quite a long relationship with this community, which I think really made this project partially more successful, perhaps because I think people were really comfortable with me and my role in the community. So I'm here today to speak about my postdoctoral research project, which is an exploratory Photovoice project aimed at better understanding experiences of aging and dementia among Southern Inuit in Labrador. So the key goal of this current research is to understand Southern Inuit cultural perceptions of transitions into aging and dementia, and the impact of these perceptions on help-seeking, caregiving, and service use, including kind of early intervention, especially around dementia. And so for the purposes of today's talk, I'll be talking mostly about their perceptions of successful aging or aging well. So I came to this project in a slightly roundabout way. When I was an undergraduate student studying anthropology, I developed kind of two really divergent interests. So one was kind of archaeology and the intersection of oral history and identity and the archaeological record, and the other was this piece around kind of cultural perceptions of dementia. And they don't really go together. So when it came to go to graduate school, I kind of had to think long and hard, what do I want to do? What's my passion? And at the time I kind of thought, well, if I don't do archaeology now, I'm probably never going to really get the chance. And it's that brought me to Labrador for the first time. So in the summer of 2007, I embarked on a 2-month field trip to Cartwright, Labrador, which is the community this project is situated in. And I carried out a survey of archaeological landscapes and historical sites up and down the southern Labrador coast, around Cartwright and in Sandwich Bay, and I interviewed residents about how interaction with these places informed their Indigenous identity and who they were. So that's me up in the corner digging with my glow-in-the-dark legs there. I haven't seen the sun in a while. So in my mind at the time, that project had very little, nothing in fact, to do with health. But as I moved through the project, I noted a trend that many of my participants, most of whom were 50 and older, kept coming back to the same discussion about their deep connection between the place they lived, who they were, and the natural environment. And this piece about aging. So as we age and our health changes, we face a choice. We can stay here with everything we know and love, with everything that makes us who we are, but have very limited access to healthcare. Or we can move away to a larger center, divorce ourselves from all the things that make us who we are, but have access to the healthcare that we might need as our health changes. And so as I kind of moved on and got through this project, that little kind of question kept sticking with me. People keep talking about this, and as I learned how much they really, really engaged with that place and how dear it was to them, I thought, there's something here. But you know how things go. I finished my MA, I needed to move on. I was looking for new supervisors, came across new projects, and I decided I needed to go back and explore that other passion, that interest in kind of dementia and cultural perceptions. And I ended up doing a project on Manitoulin Island looking at experiences and understandings of dementia in that context. But over the years, I stayed in touch with people in the community. Facebook is an interesting tool when you're a researcher, when people friend you on Facebook from a community you've worked in. And I kind of watched this community grow and change as I was away, and I'd follow people's messages, and the woman I stayed with had a baby and named her after me, and this kind of said to me, okay, I'm meant to be here, this is my place. And so when I was looking to move on to do a postdoctoral project, I thought, okay, I think this is an interesting place to explore kind of transitions into aging, the meaning of place, the meaning of landscape, and how people's lives in southern Labrador are influenced by where they live. But also I wanted to look at that dementia piece because we know so little about dementia among Indigenous pieces, and that really kind of came out of my PhD work. So the idea that if we know how people age healthily, then we have a better understanding of the impacts of dementia. And the other thing that was really important to me, and that's really important in a lot of Indigenous research, is maintaining that continuity with communities, not just kind of jumping in, jumping out, taking the data and running away forever. These people had kind of put this forward to me, not really knowing at the time that they were asking me to do a project, but they'd articulated something to me that was important to them. And it was important to me to kind of honor that and go back and maintain those conversations and try and help them make change. So today I'll talk a little bit about my project goals, and then I'll move on to talk really briefly about Indigenous health and aging, which in itself could be about a whole course. I actually just taught a whole course about that, so don't touch on too much of that here today. Then I'll briefly talk about kind of conceptualizations of successful aging, both kind of in dominant biomedical terms and in terms of Indigenous perceptions. And then I'll get into kind of the Photovoice project and my project results, as well as some future directions. Okay, so First Nations, Inuit, and Métis older adults are among Canada's most vulnerable citizens. Compared to the larger Canadian population, a large proportion of Indigenous older people live with poor health, which includes increased risk factors for chronic conditions such as arthritis, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and diabetes, as well as a higher likelihood of having multiple comorbid conditions. They also have lower longevity as a population. So the poor physical and mental health of this population can be associated with disruptions in their way of life caused by colonization, including the effects of intergenerational trauma and the residential school experience. Many of the healthcare disparities that are experienced in the Indigenous population can be linked to disadvantages in the social determinants of health, including low socioeconomic status, low levels of education, poor housing, poor access to health services, racism, language barriers, and cultural differences. So often, Indigenous older adults have more complex health needs, but are also living in places where it's more difficult for them to access the proper levels of care. So like I said, we could talk about that all day, but in the interest of time, I'll move on. So it's really important to consider this, the health of Indigenous populations, and the context within which older people's health and well-being have been conceptualized in terms of policy, programming, and research. So a major model which has influenced thinking about aging over the last 3 decades is successful aging, which is a concept that many of you will be familiar with. It's pretty pervasive. So the dominant model developed by Rowan Kahn in the late 1980s sets out 3 main criteria for success, which include a low probability of disease and disability, high functional capacity, and an active engagement with life. Now, when we look about what I just said about Indigenous populations and the health of that population, we can immediately see that there might be some problems here if we're trying to capture Indigenous people within this model. There's a bit of a disconnect. You know, most Indigenous people at the population level, if we look at the Indigenous population, you can kind of knock that health ball right off that model, and then where are you? How can they achieve this model's criteria for success if they don't have that health piece? And many critiques have been identified for this model, so it's been frequently criticized for its focus on function, its focus on individual behavior and the ability to control your outcomes as you age, a lack of cultural relevance, and applicability to marginalized and minority groups. And there's a concern that these biomedically based models grounded in Western intellectual paradigms fall short of representing diverse groups, including Indigenous peoples. And in fact, that they threaten to portray Indigenous elders as aging less successfully than their non-Indigenous counterparts. There's a kind of growing body of work around Indigenous successful aging at the moment, and the themes that are emerging there talk much more about a very holistic perception of aging and aging well. So it involves the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual realms. And then there's this deep sense of kind of connectedness to your family, to your community, to the place that you live. Engagement, particularly in a specific way of life, kind of tied to the land and subsistence activities. And health and wellness certainly play a role, but it seems in most of these communities that attitude is the big driver, not perfect health, because so many people are ill. So as we increasingly recognize the value of Indigenous ways of knowing, it is important to discuss the value of respecting how Indigenous people understand their health as they age, so that culturally safe approaches to prevention, health promotion, and care can be developed. So the objectives for my project included how do Southern and Central Labrador Inuit perceive the transition into aging and dementia? What are the implications of these perceptions on prevention, early intervention, help seeking, and caregiving? What strengths or challenges exist that relate to healthy aging or coping with dementia? And what culturally appropriate supports and services are needed to promote healthy aging and improve people's ability to cope with dementia at individual, family, and community levels? So to answer these questions, I knew I wanted to take an approach that was community-based, participatory, and had the opportunity for kind of a novel knowledge mobilization approach. And as I kind of listened around me and heard what was kind of coming through the pipes in terms of new research methods, Photovoice really seemed to address a lot of these areas quite well. So I was intrigued to see how it might work in this context. So what is Photovoice? Photovoice is a participatory arts-based qualitative method in which participants are provided with cameras, or they use their own cameras in some instances, and they're asked to take photographs to illustrate their lived experience. So Photovoice has its roots in kind of visual sociology and anthropology, and it was developed with the goals of enabling participants to record strengths and concerns in their community. So the idea here was that this could facilitate critical thinking and dialogue about community issues in both small and large group settings, and then make the research visible to policymakers, and as a result, potentially influence social change. So in its most common form, Photovoice involves recruitment and training, asking community members to take pictures to represent their lived experiences, and then a process of developing captions and meaning, usually through group discussions. And in line with the goals of community-based participatory research, Photovoice has this underlying objective to influence social change. So ultimately, a Photovoice project usually results in a photo exhibit, maybe something like the one I've put up today, maybe a little bit different, where you are sure to invite policymakers, programmers, key stakeholders in the community that might have the ability to impact change. That's kind of what it's really designed for. So how I used Photovoice, I modified it a little bit because when you're working in a community as far away as Cartwright, it's really difficult to kind of have a 12-week session where you meet once a week and talk with people and refine their ideas about their photos and send them out again. We didn't have that luxury. So that kind of coupled with the idea that I was asking about dementia in some senses, and I thought that might be quite a sensitive topic for some people. Instead of doing group meeting-making sessions, I did individual interviews with people around their photographs, which actually worked really well in this setting, and there is a precedent. It has been done in other places as well. And so as part of this project, I started, because I wanted to do this kind of participatory aspect and make sure the community was involved, I made sure to really communicate from the beginning with Nunatubet, the local Indigenous organization, long before the project started. And then because I had so many ties in the community, I touched base with some of the elders that I knew and said, hey, you know, I'm thinking of doing this. Does this make sense to you? Do you think that this would work in your community? Are my questions meaningful, and would that be useful? And people were really excited about the project and really encouraged me to come. So that made my life a lot easier. And so what I did, as I said, I went through this kind of relationship building process. Then once I got to the community, I recruited participants using a local research assistant. I had a short information session with people where I talked to them a little bit about the project, distributed cameras, told them a little bit about very basic photography skills, ran through some ethics and some Photovoice guidelines, and then sent them on their way to go into the community and take pictures, just showing their experiences with aging, with community strengths and challenges around aging, with caregiving, or with dementia. The questions were quite broad in themselves, but I also encouraged people. I said, you know, if I've not asked the right question here, please feel free to take a picture of whatever you think it is related to aging that is important to you. I really wanted to encourage them to have a voice here and to be able to control and shape the project so that it was meaningful to them. Okay, so in case some of you are wondering where exactly I was, it's about 2,600 kilometers away from here by plane. That's the little red plane down in the corner there that we flew in. You can also drive there. It'd be a long drive from here, but you could do it. But currently the road is in that condition, so you know, you might want to pack your good snow tires before you go. So needless to say, Cartwright is very remote. So I'm going to move on now to giving you just a quick primer on Southern Labrador so that you're situated in such a way that you can relate to the results, and then we'll move on to some of the project findings. So the research took place in the community of Cartwright, which is in the Nunatuvet territory, which is it's an Indigenous land claim area, an Indigenous settlement area. So in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Cartwright is located at the mouth of Sandwich Bay on the southern Labrador coast and has a population of about 500 people. And most of the people that live there are of Inuit, Innu, or European settler backgrounds. But a majority of the population would identify as having a mixed ancestry. And this is, what they're called now is Southern Inuit. This is the name that the Nunatuvet has chosen to represent these people. But in the past, they were called Labrador Métis. There's been some very complex and shifting identity politics in the region. But if you ask a lot of people in the communities now, they'll still tell you they're Métis, even though the name now formally is Southern Inuit. So historically, Cartwright was a cod and salmon fishing hub, and families in the region moved between seasonal homes and resource harvesting locations throughout the year. So they'd be kind of out on the coast or out at the river mouths in the summer, living in places where the cod and salmon fisheries were easily accessible, and in the winter they moved in to the sheltered bays where they could harvest firewood, do hunting and trapping. And this is important because this way of life really existed right up until the end of the 20th century, where people were maybe living in 2 or 3 seasonal homes throughout the year. But in the last century, traditional lifeways in this region have really been influenced by a lot of events, including the 1918 Spanish flu, resettlement programs by the government in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the construction of an U.S. military base in the 1950s and 60s, part of the Pine Tree Lines of the North Warning System, and then the closing of the cod and salmon fisheries in the 1990s. So the impact of each of these events has led to a general trend whereby people have moved in from these small communities and moved into settled locations like Cartwright. And as you'll see, this has had some pretty significant impacts or perceived impacts on health and well-being in this region. Okay, so now we'll move on to the fun part. So this is just a couple of pictures that show kind of, that's an aerial view of Cartwright in the fall. And that's Captain George Cartwright, who kind of discovered Cartwright, if you will, way back in 1792, and then kind of moving through the ages. So what does aging well or healthy aging mean to Southern Inuit? What do their pictures show, and what do they tell me? I mean, you can probably get a sense for what's important to these people by what you've seen on the walls in here today. I think they speak pretty loudly for themselves, even without any interpretation. So participants described several characteristics that described a person who might be seen to be aging well, or behaviors and enablers that contribute to old age. These include healthy old age. These include health and wellness, engagement with life, connectedness to people, place, and culture, a positive attitude, and a specific lifestyle grounded in the natural environment and in subsistence activities. So lifestyle is this kind of overarching theme, and one thing I found as I was trying to fit everything together is that this idea of our life, our traditional life, is what really spoke to people and kind of encompassed all of the other bits and pieces that contributed to health and aging. So as this particular participant said of this photo, it means a lot to me, really, because it's not only the winter scene, the wood, and my dog, and the flag, you know, it's our life. And so there were a lot of pictures like this that represented aspects of a lifeway that was really kind of uniquely Labradorian, and people were really proud to show off this lifestyle. So this outdoors-oriented way of life was perceived to contribute to health and wellness in a variety of ways, including opportunities for physical activity through work and leisure, as well as access to wild, healthy foods that are nutrient-dense and are really a counterpoint to the very expensive produce that's available in the stores and kind of the lack of healthy foods that you can buy up there. Participants described getting physical exercise through activities such as walking, snowshoeing, hunting, fishing, trapping, berry picking, things like this. So this image is one of the more creative pictures that came out of this project. This woman took about 16 pictures, and this is about 12 or 13 of them, and she said to me, I want these kind of to show a story, she said. And she said part of how this depicts aging well is because it's physical work. So it's physical labor, she says. You have to do it every day. You can put enough wood in there for a couple days, but it's physical. It's out. You've got to get out. You've got to do it, you know? You can't just sit and watch winter go by. You have to keep the house warm. You have to keep things from freezing up and stuff like that. And there's no other way to do it but to get out and do it, right? So that's how I felt when I had my own house. I could look out the window in all the snow and just cry. And I'd think, well, that's no good. That's not going to get the driveway shoveled. So you just got to get out. You don't know aches and pains and arthritis and fibromyalgia and all that, but you still got to get out and do it, right? And it feels good when you can do that. So I think this is really illustrative, not only of the perception that physical work and exercise are perceived to be important for maintaining health as you age, but also it hints of this interconnectedness aspect, this idea that our life contributes to aging well, because some of this work is just necessity. You don't have a choice. You've got to get out there and be physically active. And it also talks a little bit about how both a positive attitude and how hard work contribute to emotional and physical well-being as you age. And this was quite a common theme. So this gentleman, this is one of my favorite pictures, if I had to choose, because his wife was my research assistant, and she came to me when she said, you wouldn't believe what my husband's out there doing today. He's taking selfies in the woods. I don't think he's ever taken a selfie before. So I kind of eagerly awaited this picture, not quite sure what she was talking about, but here it came. So it was important for this gentleman to take a picture of himself out on his wood path cutting his wood to heat his house. And similar to the woman in the previous quote, he said, if I lived in an apartment where you didn't have these things, I don't know if I'd have the motivation to get out and walk and do all that stuff, you know? In wintertime, it's not bad because I can get on snowshoes, but in the summertime, it's desperately hard on to walk. If I had some way to get out of the vehicle without having to walk, I would. But really, no. Cutting firewood is the most healthy thing I do. I mean, you can't always eat as healthy as you'd like because most of the time it's not there at the stores, you know, the healthy food. But the one thing that I can do for my health is to exercise. So again, here's someone who's got pretty severe arthritis, but he's out there every day in the winter. He lives for the winter because he can get out on snowshoes and he can walk all day. And he talked about how that loosens everything up and really makes him able to live his life. So we see here again this kind of interconnectedness happening, how the act of getting outdoors is not only productive but also physically beneficial. And in another part of our conversation, this participant described that it's also a time for him to reflect on his life, get in touch with nature, which is something he associated with kind of reliving memories and getting in touch with his roots and thinking sometimes about his ancestors. So this illustrates that, again, that there are kind of perceived physical as well as cognitive emotional benefits to getting outside. So another participant also shared this feeling much more in terms of the mental health aspect of things. So speaking about taking pictures for this project, she said, yesterday was the day. I made up my mind when I got up. I got to get up and get the water and get the mountains and get everything that makes me feel good. So this was a really common thing. Another participant said, I think it's good for their mental health, older people, you know? You can't go out into the country with anybody in Labrador, but they will express their appreciation. Isn't this wonderful? What a day, you know? You can tell there's a deep appreciation for getting out on the land. So people described getting out on the land not only as something enjoyable for leisure, but also as a kind of counterpoint to the really kind of busy and engaged lives they might lead in town. As an outsider who thinks that this community is pretty remote, and to be there, it was interesting to me that people were always talking about getting away from town and getting more remote. They wanted to go to their cabins, they wanted to go away, they wanted to go fishing, and it was a really deep pull. So the counterpoint to that was kind of what happens in town, and engagement was a theme that emerged strongly in interviews. So most participants described themselves as being very heavily involved in their communities. Women described roles in the church, at the local senior center, on town committees, as well as participation in subsistence activities, hobbies, paid employment, and as care providers for older relatives and grandchildren. One woman told me, that's just a snapshot of some of the things that different participants showed that they do to fill their days. This woman told me, "IB's involved in most everything, eh? What's going on whatever's going on, I'm down there. If I'm free, I'm there. I never miss as much. We goes into the woods, me and my husband. He's got Parkinson's. So I go in with him and help him with the wood, and cooks me dinner and cooks me supper, and by, I'll tell you, the day's not long enough. Before you get turns around proper, sure, the day is gone. I've got lots to do to fill my time. I goes over to the center when that's open and does my bingo and goes to darts." So, I mean, I think we all know in research that when you end up talking to people, the people you talk to tend to be the people that are the more engaged. So it's a little bit of a tricky thing to make full generations across the broad spectrum, but I think when you hear these people talking about their level of engagement and about their productivity, it's easy to forget that most of these people had some kind of semi-major illness. The people I've spoken about have had fibromyalgia, this woman's a cancer survivor, the other one has severe arthritis. Most of the participants in this project had dealt with some kind of major health episode at some point in their life, in their older life. But they're kind of, this sense of kind of stick-to-itiveness exists there, and I think that's partially because of just living the Labrador life for a long time. You wouldn't have had really much other option if you were living out in these little tiny fishing villages, but to take care of yourself, but to keep going, because there wasn't really anything else you could do. And kind of having that positive attitude and maintaining your interests as you age were expressed as very important to people. And social connectedness, my slide's really good over. So this is a picture of the senior center, and people also talked about how social connectedness was very important to them, and how this was an avenue for kind of laughing together, talking together, but also sharing that kind of common past, talking about your roots, talking about the way of life, talking about how things used to be, because things have changed so much. And this picture is just a picture of some of the healthy foods that people like to partake in. They talked about healthy food as a contributor to healthy aging. So this is some fresh char that this woman, or frozen char, this woman caught in the summer and likes to serve. And she started growing her own spring onions because they were up to $4 a bunch in town that year. And then this is a picture of one of the old fishing communities, kind of with the red berries that they like to pick there. Pardon me?
That's a lot of berries.
Oh, you ain't seen nothing. These people, the people are passionate about their berries, particularly the older people. Like you feel this sense as the summer draws to a close, like people just can't wait to berry picking season. But this is something they talk about in terms of the younger generation. The younger generation doesn't want to bother with berries. Because they got sweets at the store, they've got candy, they've got things they can access. For a lot of these people, your berries were your treat all winter long. You save those, somebody told me about having this really strong childhood memory of going out to the shed where the big bucket of berries was, and it was frozen, and you'd chip some off with your dipper, and you'd bring it in and have it with a warm slice of bread as your special snack. And so this is kind of illustrative too of some of the changes that are putting pressures on people's ability to be healthy as they age, especially for the upcoming generation. And then this last picture is a picture of what they call the run in Cartwright. So it's taken from the top of the hill where the military base was. It's now defunct and totally taken down. But this man took this kind of panoramic set of shots because he said, every single person in this community goes through those waters in that spot. Almost anybody. If you're berry picking, if you're hunting, if you're on skidoo, if you're in a boat, if you're fishing, everybody goes through that spot. And so we really took this picture to illustrate the importance of place to everybody in the community and how that is a shared sense of identity. And he talked about that in terms of the importance for people to age in place if they could. And for him, this was particularly meaningful because his father had dementia. And he would use place to anchor his father and to kind of bring him back to the present moment. He'd say, "This is your fish stage. This is the path you took to go hunting. This can help you come back." And for a time that worked. And he tells this story. I didn't write the quote down here, but he tells this story about one day when his father was quite deep into dementia. He was in his 90s. And he took him out in the boat, finally got him out in the boat, and he said they went out on the boat all day and the stories just rolled. He said it's like he got his dad back. They took him out on the land and he just came alive. So he really used this set of pictures as an example of how that connectedness to place can really be beneficial in a way if you can figure out a way to harness it as people age. So now I'm going to move on a little bit to talk about some of the barriers and challenges that people talked about. There were a lot of positives, but there were also challenges in the community, and I've alluded to some of them. So this is a picture of the health center. It was built around the 1930s. The Labrador Grenfell Association was a pretty big player up and down the southern Labrador coast, and they put a lot of health centers in each of the communities. So for many years, this small clinic, which is now just a nursing station, was almost a fully functional hospital. You could get an x-ray there, you could give birth there, they had midwives, they had a dentist, they had everything you need. But over time, especially since the collapse of the fishery, a lot of these services have been pulled back, and now it's just kind of 3 nurses that they have in the community. So for people talking about aging and talking about maintaining their health as they age, they talked about the difficulty of accessing health services and about how the clinic is so great and we love the nurses and they're very good and we get some benefits from that, like after hours care if we need it. But there was this real tension because a lot of people didn't want to leave to get care because they were worried that they'd never get to come back to their community. This was really significant. And if you see how far people have to go to get care, you'll understand part of the concern. So the nearest kind of fully functional hospital is about 400 kilometers away. It's about a 6-hour drive. Remember that road I showed you before? 6-hour drive on those road conditions when you're not doing well, assuming you can get there because the weather's cooperating, is really tough. They do have medevac services and they have the plane, but again, these are kind of tough things. It's not a comfortable situation. When I was flying into the community, I sat behind a gentleman who was quite elderly and he had a tremor, and I could see the catheter bag hanging out of his sleeve, and he had to sit on these tiny chairs. They're narrower than the chairs you were sitting on, and there he is trying to get home, And there was a weather warning that day, so there's a possibility, depending which community we got to, if we got turned back after 3 stops, he would have had to fly back. 3 stops, 4 stops back to the community. So access to healthcare is a real concern for people. And people talk about this in terms of their inconveniences to travel as well as the costs, because a lot of them are on fixed incomes, and often the difficulty of securing appointments. And what do you do if you can't get an appointment or you get turned back? You have to wait too long and you have to turn around. So this is a picture of the grocery store. This is a bit of a unique picture. The boat hadn't been able to get in for 2 weeks, but gives you a picture of why food insecurity is a concern. And participants also talked a lot about the quality of water in their communities. So there was long-term boil water advisories in the community. People can't drink the water that comes out of their tap. They do now have a station in town where you can fill up fresh filtered water, but that's new. And as you can see, depending on what's going on with the weather and the access to Cartwright, there might be significant limitation on the types of kind of fresh produce you can access. And then there was this kind of broader level, a higher order of concerns, mostly related to the impacts of colonization and the impacts of the Labradorian way of life, which emerged as a really significant barrier to aging well. So I'll talk you through a couple of the pictures here. The top left picture with the 2 gentlemen is a picture of protesters protesting Muskrat Falls. It's the kind of hydroelectric dam that's going in Lower Churchill Falls in southern Labrador. And there's been a lot of concern around this lately because of fears of methylmercury contamination as they flood the reservoir and as the dam gets filled. So there were a lot of protests this fall in relation to that. The top picture is, top to the middle black and white one is a picture of that military base that was in Cartwright in the 50s and 60s. And people talk about that in terms of their health, not only because of the things it brought to the community. So people in Cartwright had access to, say, oranges and pineapples for a time when people in Newfoundland didn't, because they had the American military in town that would bring all sorts of interesting things with them. But when the military left, the military just left. They dumped everything, including a lot of things that were really heavy in PCBs. When you talk to people in the community, they talk directly about this and link it to the really high incidence of cancer in their community, and then link that to their own perspectives of their aging experience and how difficult it can be. The picture on the top right corner is the Lockwood School. That was the residential school that was in the community. And one woman was very candid with me and did share that she had been a resident at the residential school for 8 or 9 years during her childhood. And she talked about starving, and I haven't shown the pictures of the other things she's shown, but she showed pictures of houses in the community, people that had given her bread when she was starving as a student at this residential school. And I nearly couldn't continue this interview because I respected her so much for being willing to talk to me about it, but I also thought, especially in southern Labrador, where there have been questions about kind of how Indigenous they are, or where they fit in the scheme of things as kind of a southern adaptation of Inuit culture. I think sometimes it's been overlooked that they also have this history, especially since they weren't part of Canada when all of this was going on, but they did have their own residential school experiences. And this woman did say that she thinks it's had long-term mental impacts that continue to impact her as she ages. And so then there's some pictures of salmon and caribou, because not only are there, have the fisheries collapsed, which has had huge economic impacts in the communities, but there's also limits on what people can fish for food fishery during the year. And so I think the rule is if you're Southern Inuit, you get 6 salmon for the year. That's it. Once that's gone, that's gone. And also the caribou hunt has been shut down for about 10 years now. So people in the community would tell me, well, the government tells us there's 100,000 dead caribou on the landscape. We haven't seen them. You know, if there's that many dead, we'd see the bodies. But also there's this idea that, you know, they're shouldering perhaps the consequences or some of the blame for this loss of this food resources. It's not likely them that caused the loss of this food resources. It's these larger order issues, such as the building of dams and such as you know, mineral exploration projects and things like this. But here they are, they're having a direct impact on the health of this population. And this bottom map, it's really difficult to see. My husband told me so. I'll have to tell him he was right, even on the screen. But you can probably make out that there's a bunch of red dots, and then there's kind of 2 yellow words. All those red dots were all the communities that used to exist at kind of peak of the cod fishing industry. And those 2 yellow dots are the 2 permanent communities that exist. So that's where people were moved to as part of resettlement programs, and that's where people live now, where the services are, the post office, the bank, the schools. And that's really changed ways of life in quite a way. But people still maintain a lot of those properties. I know older people, the gentleman in the first slide, actually, I've lost count of how many properties he and his wife maintain, because he's got his family's 2 or 3 places that they fished, and then he's got her family's 2 and 3 places, and they're a going concern all winter. They're on the skidoo, they're out, they're berry picking for weeks at a time, and they're not particularly healthy either. But it's so important to them to live this life, because that's what health means to them, that they kind of grin and bear it and go anyways. Okay, so running out of time a little bit, but I just wanted to move on a little bit and talk a bit about knowledge mobilization and impact in terms of the Photovoice project, because part of the goals of a Photovoice project are to kind of influence social change and draw awareness to issues. So I think each of you will have had your own kind of response to some of the pictures. Some of them will have spoken more to you than others. Some of them might raise questions for you, and some of them might be easy to understand. And they're curated to a degree because people took about 250 pictures total, 14 people. And I can't hang that many on the walls, although all the rest are in that binder. But I've really left them kind of raw also. I've selected the quotes that go with them, but I've really tried not to kind of interpret them, not to group them together in certain ways, because I think they give a feeling altogether. And that's what I did. I took this exhibit back to the community because I wanted everybody to give me their feedback on the project. Did I get it right? Did the photos tell the story they wanted to be told? So kind of in line with what people had told me was important to them, I hosted a seniors dinner, senior supper. Mix my dinners and my suppers when I'm not in Labrador. For them, dinner is definitely lunch. So I held a senior supper, and I invited local representatives from the Indigenous governing body, from the provincial government, and the mayor of town came as well. And I invited all the participants as well as any older people in the community that wanted to come, to have this supper, to come together, to be social, to laugh, to look, to talk. And it was a really neat moment where it kind of reinforced, the dissemination of the project reinforced the things that they had told me. And the neat thing that kind of happened was that people really responded so well, and the mayor came, and I'm going to talk about him in just a minute, but the mayor came, and his wife works at the local school. She's a teacher, she's a vice principal. And she went home that night and talked to the principal, and they were really excited. And they called me up, and they said, "Can you leave it up tomorrow?" And I got 3 classrooms from the school, which actually is about 9 grade levels. So all except one group from the school. So I probably had about 70 to 80% of the entire school came down to look at this exhibit. And they tied it into units they were doing on culture and identity and resettlement. And I thought, what an amazing way for them to connect with their culture and connect with the ways that people in their culture understand health. So I got to give the kids a little talk, get them to look at things, and their sense of excitement was incredible. You know, I know that, that's my grandpa, I've been there, that's my cabin. And you really got this sense of this continuity that people are fighting so hard to preserve. And then I had an open house the next evening for anyone else in town that still hadn't come by. And interestingly, as again, I'll talk about the mayor in a moment, it was the people my age that were the most strongly impacted by these images. So as I mentioned, Muskrat Falls is this hydroelectric dam project. It's caused a lot of a stir this fall in Labrador, and this was all kind of blowing up when I was there doing this project. So the mayor of town came to my project, and he said to me, well, he stood up in front of everybody and welcomed me, and then said, "Okay, you've done something here." He started to cry. He was so moved looking at the pictures and thinking about the elders in his life, particularly those that weren't healthy and weren't able to engage in this lifestyle anymore, that he was moved to tears. And what happened was, in an effort to protest Muskrat Falls, he wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, to the premiers, and to the ministers in Newfoundland and for Canada, and he talked about my project. And he told them the story of how he was brought to tears and how he saw the importance of the place and the environment and the ability to keep carrying on this way of life. He says, "I was blown away and in fact moved to tears. I felt that my generation has a responsibility to keep our elders mentally healthy by doing whatever we can to ensure that they never lose their place in society. In Labrador, that means being on the land and water and carrying on their traditions and way of life." So seeing how much that impacted him, I thought, okay, there is something that can be said here for the potential for Photovoice to make people think about change and what can be done. And so that was really, really positive for me.
Do you mind just reading what he had written?
Sure. So that last bit that I said was, so he said, "I'm 35 years old. 2 days ago I attended an exhibit created by Dr. Jessica Pace and the seniors of Cartwright, whereby they took pictures of the things that they valued as they aged and had captions written by them, the seniors. When I first went to attend, I was simply going for ceremonial purposes, to bring greetings from the town. It turned out to be an eye-opener. As the people of my community age, it is clear to me that nothing is more important to them than family and being able to be on the land and water. It is their place, and the effects of dementia and other aging mental health issues can actually be mitigated by helping them keep their traditions alive. I was blown away and in fact moved to tears. I felt that my generation has a responsibility to keep our elders mentally healthy by doing whatever we can to ensure that they never lose their place in society. In Labrador, that means being on the land and on the water, carrying on their traditions and way of life." So, to me, this has had impact. If it doesn't go farther than that, it's had impact. But I think that it has gone further. I think people saw the meaning, and I think, in time will tell as we continue to disseminate and as I finish up my reports for the Indigenous governing body, and as we move forward, I think we'll be able to work together to generate ideas that kind of work with these ideas. Okay, this is what's important to our older people. How do we help support their ideals for a good old age, for a positive old age, for a healthy old age, by incorporating some of these things that are relevant into them, into policy and programming, by thinking about how the kind of higher powers that be can shape their aging experience. You know, I have big dreams, and I'm always careful to really promise people that I can't just wave my magic wand and make things happen, but you see in this community that the hardest things for people who are aging is the loss of mobility and the loss of that ability to get out on the land. So I think it's thinking about those things, especially as the way of life changes and a lot of the younger people have to leave the community for educational opportunities or for employment opportunities, and you don't necessarily have those built-in care networks that you used to, is let's think about kind of how might we ensure that some of the older people that might not have a relative with a boat in town anymore get an opportunity to maybe go on a boat ride in the summer, or get an opportunity to go out on the skidoo if they can handle it in the winter. And so I think moving forward there's an opportunity to harness some of those kinds of ideas and other ideas that are more representative of their conceptualizations of health and well-being as they age. And I've gone completely off script here, so I have no idea what I've missed, but in conclusion, I just like to thank you all for coming and say that I think, you know, it's really important to keep in mind that even populations that are perhaps marginalized or perhaps have poorer health profiles or perhaps face challenges can be really resilient when they age and can have really meaningful conceptualizations of what it means to age healthily and age well. And I'll end on a story I was telling Susan just a moment ago about a very good friend of mine in town who, unfortunately, her pictures are part of this exhibit, but she asked me for most of them at the end of the last exhibit, and I forgot that she had until last night, so I haven't had time to reprint them. But the picture of the berries was one of hers. And she said to me that her dad had experienced dementia. And she said she takes these pictures, and when she thinks about her aging process and what might happen if she gets dementia, that what she wants if she gets ill is that her family puts on a TV screen all of these pictures on a loop that she's taken. She's prolific in her production of pictures. She goes walking every day, all over the place, taking these pictures. And she says, that's what I want. If I lose my memory, if I lose my ability to connect with people, I want to be surrounded by the pictures I've taken of the places I've loved and the crafts that I've made from these natural materials of the places I've loved, because that's who I am. And so I think even that in itself is an idea of how we might better care for people in these communities, especially if they have to leave to go elsewhere and can't be physically in these places anymore. So that's it for me.
So that was inspiring and delightful, and we really wanted to give you a little token of our appreciation. Thank you so much, Jessica. And another round of applause. It was wonderful. So I know we're right at 1, and some people are going to have to leave. You wouldn't mind writing the forms, but you're willing to take questions for the people who can stay. Super. Thanks so much. Great. Okay, so questions? It's open floor.
How were you able to engage a sense of trust with the community initially?
Well, you know, that's a story that goes back a really long time. Because when I went there to do my master's, I was working with a woman who had a supervisor who had a lot of contacts in the community, and she kind of hooked us up with a couple people. She said, you know, these are good go-to people, these are good go-to people. And so those are the people I worked with initially during my master's. But it was really, I stayed in a bed and breakfast run by a woman my own age with young children. And we got to know each other, and we became great friends. And that's why I was saying at the beginning that she's named one of her children after me. So in that sense, I have, some people say I'm family in the community. But I think it was just maintaining that openness, that these weren't just research participants, they were people. And taking the time to check in. You know, people who sent me a Facebook friend request, I actually accepted it. And I've watched them share their pictures, and I commented on their pictures and asked them how they were doing and things like that. And then there was this other process with the Indigenous Governing Council, where I approached their research division and started talking with them and telling them what I was interested in doing, and then talking about how we might move forward in a way that was kind of sympathetic to both of our interests and needs.
So I had a question about the middle generation. You talked to a lot of them right away. How many of these people would have a daughter or son in town?
Okay. Most have like one of their children around, maybe not not in town, but in Goose Bay or on the island, I'd say. Oh, how many?
That's still 400 kilometers.
Yeah,
away there.
so several had family in the community. There's still a lot of people that have ties to some family in the community.
Cousins or nieces or something.
But there are people that don't, and I have people that will say to me things like, well, all my girls are away and they want to take care of me, but I'm not going to Toronto. I want to stay here, and I'll take that kind of calculated risk of being here. Interestingly, though, people were quite open to the idea of nursing homes, which is not something you necessarily see in other Indigenous communities.
In the town, though?
In the town. No, there's not a nursing home in the town. There's a residential care home a couple hours away in Labrador on the coast, and the nearest nursing home is in Goose Bay. And a couple of people, you know, I don't want to be a burden to my kids. I'd rather stay here. And they hope that that nursing home would be in Labrador. There's no guarantee. But yeah, it's definitely an increasing problem because there's just not economic opportunities in the community. But there are some people that are just so dedicated to living the life. The people I stay with, for example, they are to the core going to stay. They're involved in the shrimp fishery and the crab fishery, and they've invested their life in there and teaching their kids to live this life and trying to push it forward. But there is that tension that a lot of people feel, you know, what are we going to do when all the caregivers go away?
I just wondered how viable a possible board and care kind of arrangement in the town would be. If there's anything like that, or
Yeah, they do have they have seniors housing, so they have, I'm not sure how many units it is. It looks to be it's probably about 10 units. They were actually one of the communities that was slated to get the care home, but I don't know why they lost the bid, or the government went a different way. I think it'd be interesting to think about some of these new models of elder care that are coming up, and these new models of residential care, and thinking about how they might be incorporated in a way that would work in that community. As one participant said, who did have a father he cared for with dementia, it would help if things like the senior center was closer to the residential care homes, the seniors housing.
Yeah.
Because at the moment they're across town, because there are limits to the spaces available and the resources available. But I think people are becoming increasingly aware of these issues, especially with just the sheer number of health concerns in the community. One of the people that I'm sure that the mayor was thinking about, I've been told, was thinking about when he had his reaction to my event, passed away last week, of cancer, and this is a huge thing in the community. So I think it's also thinking beyond just aging and elder care, but about health care in the community in general, and how that can be supported, because people really have this strong sense of self-sufficiency and stubbornness. People don't want to leave the community. A little bit of wariness around the Western health care they're going to receive, and this idea that it'll just make them sicker and then they won't be able to come home. So I think there is a need for kind of thinking through the healthcare opportunities that there are, but also recognizing that it's unlikely that the government is going to shuttle all sorts of resources to a community where the population is shrinking, because there aren't any viable aren't many, there are some, but aren't many viable opportunities for kind of town growth and things like that. So it's a real challenge, and to be honest, I get quite emotional about it sometimes, because I see the challenge that people are living with, and it's not that different in a lot of other Indigenous communities in Canada, for sure.
Does the clinic do they have 2 dedicated nurses?
They have,
Or
yeah,
do they fly
2
in?
RNs and a public health nurse, I believe, and the doctor flies in every 6 weeks. But some communities are really lucky. There's another community I work in that has the same doctor that's been coming year in, year out. That's his little pet project. He's been there 15 years, he's been coming. Car is not so lucky. So they tend to get student doctors, foreign student doctors, flying in, different one every 6 weeks. There's a real lack of continuity of care. And so I didn't really talk at all about the dementia piece of my project today here, but like in terms of kind of something as simple as a healthcare professional being able to notice that you've got dementia, if you've got a rotating slew of trainee doctors coming into your community, there isn't that continuity of care, and it's more difficult for people to kind of catch on to those things, especially because one of the things I found is that there's just a lack of health promotion. There isn't, it's behind in ways that, compared to, say, Manitoulin Island, which is much closer to some bigger centers and which has a really active kind of health center and things like that. People just weren't as informed about some of the things that I would have expected that they might have been.
Like what?
Dementia, for example. They didn't really, the way people talked about it still, their mind is gone. That was kind of everybody. Like, they didn't really have a sense, what do you do with a person with dementia? Well, they mostly stay home. There wasn't this kind of sense of some of the things you might do to be able to make things better. Although I had a very difficult time getting people who'd experienced dementia to come forward. So lots of people kind of mentioned people they knew that had dementia, but only one family really came forward that had really lived it. So it's hard to tell. I know that's probably something we'd even see here. People that haven't been through it don't really have a sense. So the family that had been through it had come up with some really creative solutions for dealing with some of their dementia-related problems, but people say, even the home care workers, there's no training. They have to figure it out, based on the internet. You're on, it's home care, it's not even really PSWs. So people don't really have that sense of a place to go to ask those questions. And I wasn't able to talk to the nurses under my ethics. Newfoundland has some crazy ethics, and you have to get a whole separate range of ethics to talk to their healthcare providers. So that didn't really fit within the scope of this project. But it'd be interesting to know. I think it could have a really huge impact depending on which nurse was in the community at the time and how much knowledge they might have about dementia, what the trajectory might be, or when things are caught. So, yeah.
What proportion of the community are seniors compared to, you said there's 500 or so in the community, so how many seniors are there?
I don't have the exact numbers. I've been trying to find it. It's a majority and a growing majority. I'd say probably 50% anyways. This community has kind of enough critical mass that they've still got kids and little kids and pregnancies and babies. The other community I work in has about 200 people, and they haven't had a kid in kindergarten for 3 years, and no one in the community is pregnant. So you really feel that some of these communities are really feeling, more so than others, kind of what happens when there are no more kids in the school. Where are we then?
Do they use telehealth at all, like telepsychiatry and telehealth?
I believe they do. I don't know much about it, but I believe one of the women I know who has cancer experience has talked about kind of talking with her oncologist by telehealth, but I'm not sure the degree to which that's integrated. Most people talk about going to Goose Bay for appointments or going to St. John's for appointments.
Because that could be a way to get your healthcare within your community with specialists and so on. I think
The
you could do
connections
that.
aren't always good. That's the thing. Are the internet connections?
Yeah,
good?
they're okay. They're not too bad. Not quite as fast as here, but they're not too bad. Yeah, that's something definitely I'd need to look into further to know kind of what they have available. And I'll be going to a meeting where I think a lot of the Nunavut people, the Indigenous governance, will be there, and I'll perhaps have more of an opportunity now moving forward as I meet with them in February to talk about what there is available and how that meshes what people told me or what they're accessing, because what's available and what people use isn't always, always in line. So be interesting to kind of move forward, and I hope to get more opportunities to kind of move forward with this and think about some of the outcomes that might come out of this as a result of this.
Are the nurses Inuit?
No, they're usually from outside. Sometimes they'll get someone that's trained in the community, but
I mean, what about, it would make providing culturally sensitive healthcare very difficult and challenging.
difficult, yeah, and it's a really unique cultural context there, as I said. Like, most people are of mixed ancestry. It's described as kind of a continuum north to south in terms of kind of explicit outward showings of Indigenous culture in Labrador. You see kind of almost no one down in the south part of Labrador speaks Inuktitut, for example. But many do, the further north you go. And so, but all the same, you do see unique aspects of culture there and unique aspects of perceptions of health. So certainly having people that were from the community being trained and going back would be a way to improve care. kind of improve people's understanding of how to make recommendations that fit the realities of people's life, right? Don't go to the gym, but why don't you try and get out on a path for a little bit today?